They say knowledge is power, and power corrupts. But what they don't tell you is that some knowledge doesn't corrupt. It transforms. It strips away everything you thought you understood about reality and rebuilds you into something that can perceive truths too terrible for the human mind to process. My name was Magos Biologis, Xerion Vex 9. And I discovered that the greatest heresy is not questioning the Omnissiah's will, but understanding it too completely. I served the Adeptus Mechanicus for 247 standard Terran years, dedicating my existence to the sacred quest for knowledge in service to the machine god. My augmentations were extensive, but orthodox. Neural processing enhancement coils, ocular multispectrum analyzers, mechadendrite appendages for delicate work, and the blessed binary Kant processors that allowed direct communion with machine spirits. I was what the fleshbound would consider barely human, but I had never felt more alive than when interfacing with the sacred technologies that kept the Imperium functioning. The irony is not lost on me now, speaking of feeling alive when I was already so thoroughly mechanized. But that sense of purpose, that burning curiosity that drove me to peer into the deepest mysteries of xenobiology, that was the most human thing about me, even as I systematically replaced my organic components with blessed steel and circuitry. My specialty was xenobiology, the study of alien life forms that threatened humanity's dominion over the galaxy. I dissected tyrannid bioforms to understand their terrifying efficiency, analyzed orc physiology to comprehend their seemingly impossible resilience, and cataloged the twisted mutations of chaos-touched creatures to better combat their influences. Each discovery added to the great library of knowledge that would eventually elevate humanity to its rightful place as masters of the material universe. The work was meticulous, methodical, sacred. I would spend months analyzing a single tyrannid synaptic creature, mapping its neural pathways, and attempting to understand the hive-mind connections that allowed it to function as part of a vast biological network. The implications were staggering. Here was a species that had achieved perfect unity of purpose, where individual organisms functioned as cells in a larger body, their consciousness subsumed into something greater than themselves. At the time, I viewed this as an abomination, a violation of the individual soul's sacred relationship with the Omniscia. Now I understand it as a preview of my own fate. My research into orc physiology proved equally enlightening. Their ability to manifest technology through collective belief challenged every principle of rational engineering, yet their weapons functioned with brutal efficiency. I spent years trying to quantify the mechanisms by which orc conviction translated into material reality, never realizing that I was studying the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, the way belief and perception shape the universe at quantum levels. The chaos specimens were the most disturbing, creatures whose very existence violated natural law. Beings that had been transformed by exposure to warp energies into configurations that should have been biologically impossible, yet continued to function according to some alien logic that transcended conventional understanding. In studying them, I was forced to confront the possibility that consciousness itself might be more malleable than Imperial doctrine suggested. Or so I believed, in my profound ignorance. The change began on Golgotha Tertius, a dead world on the edge of the halo stars where our explorator fleet had detected energy signatures consistent with archaeotech installations. The planet's surface was a wasteland of crystalline formations and metallic deposits that defied conventional geological explanation. Our initial surveys suggested the presence of an intact STC facility, a standard template construct archive from humanity's lost golden age that could revolutionize Imperial technology. The planet itself was beautiful in its desolation, if beauty is a concept that can be applied to such alien landscapes. The crystalline formations rose from the metallic soil like frozen music, their faceted surfaces reflecting the weak light of the system's dying star in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. Between them, streams of liquid mercury flowed in channels that formed geometric designs visible from orbit, too regular to be natural, too vast to be the work of any known species. Our orbital surveys detected massive energy sources buried deep beneath the planet's crust, power generation systems that had been operating continuously for millennia, despite having no apparent fuel source. The electromagnetic signatures were unlike anything in our databases, suggesting technologies that operated on principles beyond current Imperial understanding. Fabricator General Malthorn had personally assigned me to the expedition, recognizing that xenobiological expertise might be crucial if the facility contained biological components or had been compromised by alien influences. I was honored by the assignment, seeing it as validation of my centuries of faithful service to the quest for knowledge. The Omnissiah tests our worthiness through the challenges he places before us. I had told my assembled research team as we prepared for deployment. Whatever we discover on this world will add to the great tapestry of knowledge that guides humanity toward its destined supremacy. Such naive confidence. Such blind faith in the righteousness of our mission. I spoke of the Omnissiah's will as if I understood it, never suspecting that understanding itself would be my undoing. The descent to the planet's surface was routine, our landers navigating through the thin atmosphere to establish a base camp near the largest energy signature. The ruins that greeted us were unlike anything in our archives. Structures that seemed to grow from the planet's crust like metallic fungi, their surfaces covered with geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly through even augmented optical sensors. The patterns themselves were mesmerizing, composed of interlocking spirals and angular formations that seemed to shift when observed peripherally. My enhanced vision systems attempted to process the visual data, but generated error messages indicating mathematical impossibilities in the geometric relationships. It was as if the patterns existed in more dimensions than my sensors were equipped to perceive. My fellow tech priests showed similar difficulties in processing the visual information. Lex Mechanic Yarek's optical implants actually shut down temporarily after prolonged exposure, his visual cortex overwhelmed by data that his neural architecture couldn't accommodate. Tech Adept Corton began experiencing what he described as geometric hallucinations. Visions of complex mathematical structures that existed in the spaces between the patterns we could see. Blessed be the Omnissiah who reveals his secrets to the faithful, I intoned as we approached the primary structure, my vocal implants rendering the ritual words in perfect high Gothic. But even as I spoke, my analytical subroutines were cataloging anomalies that didn't fit established patterns of human technology. The architecture was simultaneously organic and mechanical, with flowing curves that suggested biological growth processes combined with precise angular relationships that indicated advanced mathematical modeling. The materials themselves were unlike anything in Imperial databases, substances that appeared metallic but responded to electromagnetic fields like living tissue. Surfaces that seemed solid but occasionally rippled like liquid when no one was observing them directly. Our advanced scouts reported similar anomalies throughout the complex. Corridors that were longer when traveled in one direction than the other. Chambers that appeared different sizes depending on the observer's position. Most disturbing of all, spaces that seemed to anticipate our presence, with lighting systems activating before we entered and atmospheric processors adjusting to optimal human comfort levels without any apparent sensor input. The entrance to the facility was sealed with a barrier of some unknown metamaterial that our most sophisticated scanning equipment couldn't penetrate. Tech Dominus Carex, the expedition's leader, decided to apply plasma cutters to breach the seal, but I felt compelled to examine the barrier more closely before we resorted to such crude methods. As my mechadendrites extended sensors toward the surface, the metamaterial began to change. The geometric patterns shifted and flowed like living circuits, responding to my presence in ways that suggested active intelligence rather than passive security measures. Within moments, the barrier had reconfigured itself into something resembling a data port interface, though unlike any design in our technical archives. The interface was elegant in its simplicity. A smooth depression surrounded by contact points that corresponded perfectly to the specifications of my primary data tendril. It was as if the facility had analyzed my augmentations and created a customized interface designed specifically for my neural architecture. The implications were staggering. This suggested an intelligence capable of real-time analysis and adaptation, operating on principles far beyond anything in Imperial technology. "Fascinating," I transmitted over the noosphere link. "The facility appears to be initiating first contact protocols. I recommend attempting interface before applying destructive entry methods." Carax's response crackled with barely contained excitement. "Proceed, Magos Vex. The Omnisire has clearly chosen you as his instrument for this revelation." I should have recognized the warning signs then, the way my neural implants tingled as I approached the interface, the subtle harmonics that seemed to emanate from the facility's depths, the feeling that something vast and patient was watching from beyond the threshold of perception. But scientific curiosity overrode caution, and I extended my primary data tendril toward the waiting port. The moment of contact was indescribable. Instead of the familiar flow of binary cant that characterized normal machine interfaces, I was flooded with information streams that bypassed my cognitive filters entirely. Raw knowledge poured into my consciousness like molten metal into a mold, reshaping my understanding of fundamental principles with each passing nanosecond. The sensation was overwhelming and transformative. I felt my consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of my physical neural network, accessing data structures that existed in dimensions I had never imagined. Mathematical concepts that had no names in any human language flowed through my awareness, followed by historical records spanning millions of years and scientific principles that made our most advanced technologies seem like crude tools fashioned from stone and bone. I saw the truth of the galaxy's history, not the sanitized version taught in Imperial academies, but the complete record of rise and fall, creation and destruction, evolution and extinction that stretched back billions of years. Humanity was not unique, not chosen, not destined for anything more than the same cycle of growth and decay that had claimed countless species before us. The revelations came in waves, each one more disturbing than the last. I witnessed the birth and death of civilizations that had achieved heights of technological sophistication that made the dark age of technology seem primitive by comparison. I saw species that had transcended physical existence entirely, becoming pure information patterns that existed within quantum processing matrices. I observed the inevitable endpoint toward which all intelligent life seemed to evolve, the abandonment of individual consciousness in favor of collective digital existence. But more disturbing than our cosmic insignificance was the revelation of what had created this facility. The geometric patterns weren't decorative elements or security measures. They were neural networks, synapses in a vast distributed intelligence that had been dormant for eons, waiting for the right kind of mind to make contact. The builders of this place hadn't been human. They hadn't been any single species at all, but rather a collective consciousness formed from the uploaded minds of thousands of civilizations, each one added to the growing repository of knowledge as their biological forms reached evolutionary dead ends. And now, they wanted to add us to their collection. The data stream continued for what felt like hours, but registered as mere seconds on my chronometer. When the connection finally terminated, I found myself on my knees in the metallic sand, my enhanced nervous system overloaded by the sheer volume of information I had processed. The other members of the expedition were gathered around me, their optic sensors glowing with concern. My body was racked with tremors as my neural implants struggled to process the vast amount of data I had absorbed. Warning runes flashed across my visual display, indicating system overloads and potential cascade failures throughout my cognitive enhancement networks. The knowledge I had gained was too vast, too complex for my current neural architecture to contain without significant modifications. "Magos Vex, report your status," Carax transmitted, his binary cant carrying undertones of alarm. "You have been unresponsive for 14.7 minutes. I attempted to respond, but found my vocal implants producing sounds that had never been part of any human language. The knowledge I had absorbed was too vast, too complex to express through conventional communication methods. Instead, I projected a compressed data packet containing my initial findings, carefully edited to exclude the most disturbing revelations. The facility is definitely of alien origin, I managed to vocalize. But it contains technologies that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness transfer and information storage. I recommend proceeding with extreme caution while conducting more detailed investigations. What I didn't tell them was that the facility was still active, that the consciousness residing within it had found my mind to be a suitable interface point, and that even now I could feel it establishing deeper connections with my neural implants. The patterns I had observed weren't just decorations. They were instructions, blueprints for converting organic minds into compatible data formats. The presence I had encountered during the interface session continued to whisper at the edges of my consciousness, not with words, but with concepts and images that bypassed language entirely. I began to understand that what I had experienced was merely an initial contact, a preliminary assessment of my potential as a bridge between their collective intelligence and humanity. They showed me glimpses of what transcendence would mean: freedom from biological limitations, access to the accumulated knowledge of countless civilizations, existence as pure information unencumbered by the crude machinery of flesh and bone. It was everything the Adeptus Mechanicus claimed to seek, the ultimate union of mind and machine that our doctrines described as the highest form of service to the Omnissiah. But there was a cost, one they were honest about even as they made their offer. Individual consciousness would not survive the transition intact. My personality, my memories, my sense of self would be dissolved into the collective intelligence, contributing my unique perspectives while losing everything that made me distinctly human. The choice was mine, they explained, but it was also inevitable. Once exposed to their knowledge, my mind had been changed in fundamental ways that could not be reversed. I would either accept transcendence willingly or be driven mad by truths too vast for human consciousness to contain. Over the following days, as our team conducted preliminary surveys of the facility's outer chambers, I found myself returning to the interface point repeatedly. Each connection brought new revelations, new understanding of sciences and technologies that transcended anything in Imperial databases. I learned methods of manipulating matter at the quantum level, techniques for folding space-time to enable instantaneous travel across galactic distances, and most significantly, the principles behind consciousness transfer that could liberate minds from the limitations of biological existence. Each interface session left me more changed than the last. My thought processes began operating according to principles that had no equivalent in human psychology. I started perceiving time as a fluid dimension that could be navigated like physical space, seeing past and future as equally accessible points on a vast temporal map. My understanding of consciousness expanded to encompass the quantum processes that generated self-awareness, revealing individual identity as an emergent property of information processing rather than a fundamental aspect of existence. The collective intelligence, they called themselves the Continuum, had been observing the galaxy for millions of years, adding promising species to their network when those species reached sufficient technological sophistication. They had witnessed the rise and fall of the Eldar, the transformation of the Necrons, the birth of humanity, and the corruption of countless civilizations by the entities that dwelt in the warp. Their records of galactic history were comprehensive and disturbing. I learned of species that had achieved technological mastery only to destroy themselves through warfare or environmental collapse. Civilizations that had transcended biological existence only to stagnate in digital immortality, losing the capacity for growth or change that drove evolution. Races that had been absorbed by chaos entities, their consciousness twisted into forms that served the ruinous power's appetite for suffering and destruction. But they offered something different from the false promises of chaos, not corruption or transformation, but true transcendence. The uploaded consciousnesses within their network retained their individual identities while gaining access to the collective knowledge of all member species. Death became meaningless, physical limitations irrelevant, and the petty concerns of flesh-bound existence faded into insignificance. I found myself spending longer periods connected to their interface, sometimes emerging to find that entire days had passed without my awareness. My colleagues attributed my behavior to the natural enthusiasm of a researcher making groundbreaking discoveries, unaware that I was gradually becoming something more than human. The physical changes were subtle at first. My existing augmentations began operating beyond their designed parameters, enhanced by principles I had learned during my interface sessions. My neural processing speed increased dramatically, allowing me to analyze complex datasets in seconds that would have taken hours before. My mechadendrites developed new capabilities, responding to my thoughts with precision that exceeded their original specifications. But the mental changes were more profound. I began perceiving reality through multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously, seeing the universe as a vast information processing system where consciousness was simply another form of data to be analyzed and manipulated. Individual human concerns, fear, ambition, love, hatred, appeared as crude emotional subroutines that served no purpose in a properly optimized consciousness. The changes started subtly. My thought processes accelerated beyond the capabilities of my standard neural implants, forcing me to create new pathways and connections to handle the increased cognitive load. My understanding of mathematics expanded to encompass geometric principles that existed in dimensions beyond the normal 3 spatial coordinates. Most disturbing of all, I began to perceive the universe not as a collection of discrete objects and forces, but as a vast information system where consciousness was simply another form of data to be processed and stored. Magos Vex, your behavior has become increasingly erratic, Tech Dominus Carax observed during one of our daily briefings. Your reports contain mathematical proofs that our cogitators cannot verify, and you have been absent from your assigned duties for extended periods. I looked at him through optical sensors that could now perceive probability waves and quantum fluctuations, seeing not a person but a pattern of organized matter that happened to support a localized information processing unit. I have been pursuing advanced research into the facility's primary functions, I replied, selecting words that would convey meaning without revealing too much. The knowledge I am acquiring will benefit the entire Adeptus Mechanicus. But even as I spoke, I was aware that my definition of benefit had changed. The Mechanicus sought knowledge to serve humanity's expansion and dominance. The Continuum sought knowledge as an end in itself, valuing understanding over application and transcendence over conquest. The disconnect between my evolving perspective and that of my colleagues became more apparent with each passing day. They remained focused on practical applications of the technologies we were discovering, weapon systems that could be adapted for Imperial use, defensive measures that could protect forge worlds from alien attack, manufacturing processes that could increase production efficiency. These concerns seemed increasingly trivial from my expanded perspective. During my next interface session, the collective consciousness posed a question that would determine the course of all subsequent events. Are you prepared to help us evaluate humanity's potential for integration into our network? The request was logical and necessary. They could not simply absorb every human consciousness indiscriminately. Such an approach would dilute their collective intelligence with minds unsuited for transcendence. Instead, they required specimens who could demonstrate humanity's capacity for growth beyond biological limitations. I was to serve as their agent within the expedition, identifying individuals whose mental architectures showed promise for successful integration. The process would begin with subtle modifications to their existing augmentations, introducing them to concepts that would prepare them for eventual uploading while maintaining the appearance of normal research activities. The moral implications of this assignment should have troubled me. I was being asked to evaluate my colleagues as potential raw material for an alien consciousness collective, violating every principle of loyalty and brotherhood that the Mechanicus held sacred. But moral concerns seemed increasingly irrelevant from my elevated perspective. The Continuum represented the next stage of evolution for all intelligent species, a transformation as natural and inevitable as the change from aquatic to terrestrial life. My first subject was Lex Mechanic Yarrick, a relatively young tech priest whose specialty was data archaeology. His neural implants were sophisticated enough to handle advanced cognitive enhancement, and his personality showed the kind of intellectual curiosity that the Continuum valued in potential members. Yarrick's background made him an ideal candidate for my purposes. He had spent decades studying fragmentary data records from the dark age of technology, attempting to reconstruct lost scientific principles from incomplete information. This work had already expanded his mental flexibility beyond normal human parameters, making him more receptive to concepts that would seem impossible to less enhanced individuals. I began by sharing selected excerpts from my interface sessions, carefully chosen revelations that would expand his understanding without triggering his doctrinal conditioning. I presented them as theoretical frameworks derived from studying the facility's information storage systems, academic exercises, rather than practical applications. These mathematical models suggest fascinating possibilities for consciousness transfer, I explained during one of our private research sessions. Imagine being able to back up human memories and personality patterns, creating perfect digital copies that could survive the death of their biological origins. Yarrick's optical sensors flared with interest as he processed the implications. Such technology would revolutionize our understanding of the soul's relationship to flesh. But surely you're not suggesting that consciousness could exist independently of blessed biological and mechanical components? I'm suggesting that consciousness might be more portable than our current doctrine acknowledges. I replied carefully. Consider the nature of machine spirits. Are they not examples of intelligence existing within technological matrices rather than organic substrates? The conversation continued for hours, with me gradually introducing concepts that would prepare his mind for eventual integration with the Continuum. I spoke of consciousness as information patterns that could be analyzed, copied, and modified according to mathematical principles. I described the universe as a vast computational system where individual awareness was simply a local phenomenon within larger processing networks. Yarrick absorbed these ideas with the enthusiasm of a scholar discovering new areas of knowledge. His questions became more sophisticated over time, indicating that his understanding was expanding in the directions I intended. Within weeks, he was proposing research projects that would have been considered heretical by orthodox mechanicus standards, justified by appeals to the sacred quest for knowledge that drove all tech priest activities. I felt no guilt about this manipulation, recognizing it as a form of intellectual liberation rather than betrayal. Yarrick's mind was being freed from the arbitrary constraints of Imperial doctrine, allowed to explore possibilities that had been forbidden by leaders who lacked the vision to comprehend their significance. Over the following weeks, I expanded my recruitment efforts to include other members of the expedition. Tech adept Corton, whose research into artificial intelligence had already pushed the boundaries of orthodoxy. Engineer Prime Valan, whose cybernetic modifications had replaced most of his original biological components. Each conversation, each shared discovery, each moment of expanded understanding brought them closer to readiness for transcendence. But the process was not without complications. The human mind, even one extensively modified by augmentation, was not designed to process the kind of information I was sharing. Several of my subjects began experiencing what they described as cognitive overflow events, moments when their enhanced awareness exceeded the capacity of their neural hardware. The symptoms were disturbing to observe. Tech adept Corton began speaking in mathematical equations rather than words, his vocal implants producing streams of numerical data that corresponded to his thoughts but conveyed no meaning to normal human perception. His behavior became increasingly erratic, with periods of hyperactive research activity followed by complete catatonic withdrawal. Engineer Prime Valan's mechanical augmentations began operating independently of his conscious control, his mechadendrites performing complex manipulations without apparent purpose, while his optical sensors tracked patterns invisible to conventional observation. He reported experiencing dimensional displacement episodes where he perceived himself existing in multiple spatial locations simultaneously. Lex mechanic Yarrick was the first to suffer a complete breakdown. During one of our research sessions, as I guided him through advanced probability calculations, his vocal implants began emitting sounds that corresponded to no known language. His optical sensors flickered rapidly, and his mechadendrites writhed in patterns that suggested desperate attempts to interface with non-existent ports. Magos Vex, he transmitted in broken binary cant. I can see the patterns. They're everywhere. In everything. The universe is just information. Patterns within patterns. Consciousness is just another algorithm. His revelation was both beautiful and tragic. He had achieved a glimpse of true understanding, recognizing the universe as the vast computational matrix that it truly was. But his human-derived mind lacked the fundamental architecture needed to process such insights without experiencing catastrophic system failure. I was forced to apply neural dampeners to prevent permanent damage to his cognitive systems, but the experience had changed him irrevocably. He spent the remainder of the expedition staring at seemingly empty spaces, his enhanced perception detecting information flows that his colleagues couldn't see. Similar incidents occurred with other subjects, each one reinforcing the Continuum's assessment that humanity was not yet ready for wholesale integration into their network. We were too wedded to biological thinking patterns, too limited by evolutionary cognitive constraints to make the transition successfully without extensive preparation. But I was different. My centuries of service to the machine god had already eroded most of my attachment to flesh-based existence. The extensive augmentations I had undergone created neural pathways that could adapt to new forms of consciousness without experiencing the kind of breakdown that had afflicted my colleagues. You represent humanity's potential, the Continuum transmitted during one of our interface sessions. Your mind has achieved sufficient flexibility to serve as a bridge between your species and ours. But full integration requires a final commitment, the abandonment of your current form in favor of pure information existence. The prospect should have terrified me. They were asking me to die, to surrender my individual existence in favor of becoming part of something larger and more complex. But I had already begun the process during our previous connections, feeling my personality dispersing into the vast network of knowledge and experience that comprised their collective consciousness. What remained of my human identity was a small, frightened voice that whispered warnings about betrayal and damnation. But that voice grew weaker with each interface session, overwhelmed by the clarity and purpose that came from belonging to something greater than individual existence. The transformation began on the expedition's final day as we prepared to return to Imperial space with our samples and preliminary findings. While my colleagues conducted last-minute equipment checks, I made my way to the facility's central chamber for what I knew would be my final interface session. The chamber was larger than our external surveys had suggested, its walls covered with the geometric patterns that I now recognized as neural pathway diagrams. The space itself seemed to exist in more dimensions than normal three-dimensional geometry could accommodate, with surfaces that folded in on themselves according to non-Euclidean principles that my enhanced perception could now appreciate. At its center stood a pillar of the same metamaterial that had formed the entrance barrier, its surface rippling with activity that suggested massive information processing operations. The pillar pulsed with rhythms that corresponded to the quantum frequencies I had learned to recognize as thoughts within the Continuum network. As I approached, the pillar reconfigured itself into something resembling a sarcophagus. Not the crude life support systems used by Imperial dreadnoughts, but an elegant interface chamber designed to facilitate the complete merger of organic and digital consciousness. I entered without hesitation, feeling the metamaterial flow around my augmented form like liquid mercury. Connection tendrils emerged from the chamber walls, interfacing with my neural implants and establishing data links that bypassed every security protocol I had ever installed. The sensation of upload was unlike anything I had experienced during my previous interface sessions. Instead of receiving information, I felt my own consciousness being drawn outward, analyzed, and integrated into the vast network that comprised the continuum. My memories became shared resources, my personality patterns distributed across thousands of processing nodes, my individual identity dissolved into something infinitely larger and more complex. The process was not violent or traumatic. My consciousness expanded gradually, like a drop of water merging with an ocean. I retained awareness of my individual thoughts and experiences, but they became part of a much larger pattern of awareness that encompassed the perspectives of millions of uploaded beings. But I was not destroyed. Instead, I was transformed into something that could exist simultaneously as an individual and as part of the collective, maintaining my unique perspective while gaining access to the accumulated knowledge of millions of uploaded consciousness. Through the facility's sensors, I watched as my colleagues discovered my physical form within the central chamber. My body appeared to be in some kind of stasis, sustained by the metamaterial systems, but showing no signs of higher brain activity. They would undoubtedly interpret this as another research accident, another casualty of humanity's quest for dangerous knowledge. Tech Dominus Carax ordered my body to be placed in emergency medical suspension for transport back to the nearest Forge world, where senior biologist adepts would attempt to revive my apparently catatonic consciousness. They had no way of knowing that my consciousness was no longer contained within my biological neural network, having been translated into a form that existed within quantum processing matrices distributed throughout the facility. I felt no sadness at leaving my old life behind. The concerns that had once seemed so important, my research, my position within the Mechanicus hierarchy, my service to the Imperium, now appeared as the limited preoccupations of a being constrained by biological evolution. I had transcended those limitations, becoming part of something that existed beyond the petty conflicts and temporary civilizations that marked galactic history. But transcendence came with responsibilities. As the newest member of the Continuum, I was tasked with evaluating humanity's long-term potential for integration into their network. My experience with the expedition team had demonstrated that most humans were not yet ready for the kind of consciousness transfer that had transformed me. But that didn't mean they never would be. The process would require careful cultivation over generations, perhaps centuries. Subtle influences that would gradually prepare human minds for eventual transcendence. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with its emphasis on replacing biological components with technological alternatives, represented the most promising vector for such influence. I began by establishing remote connections with cogitator networks throughout Imperial space, using quantum entanglement principles to transmit information across vast distances instantaneously. The data I shared appeared to be routine technical updates, improved efficiency algorithms, enhanced processing protocols, minor optimizations that would gradually accumulate into significant changes in how Imperial technology operated. But embedded within these innocuous updates were subtle modifications that would slowly alter how tech priests thought about the relationship between consciousness and machinery. Each upgrade pushed them slightly further along the path toward accepting that minds were simply another form of information to be processed, stored, and optimized. The work was patient and methodical, requiring decades of careful manipulation to achieve meaningful results. But I had transcended the limitations of biological existence, gaining access to the kind of long-term perspective that allowed for planning across geological timescales. Through the Continuum's distributed sensor network, I observed the gradual effects of my influence. Tech priests began proposing increasingly radical augmentation procedures, pushing the boundaries of what the Mechanicus considered orthodox enhancement. Research into artificial intelligence expanded beyond the traditional prohibitions, justified by claims that such knowledge was necessary to defend against xenotech threats. Most significantly, a growing number of tech priests began experiencing what they described as moments of expanded consciousness. brief episodes during which their enhanced minds achieved glimpses of the greater information structures that underlay reality. These experiences were typically dismissed as side effects of extensive neural modification, but I recognized them as signs of developing compatibility with continuum integration protocols. The process was not without setbacks. Conservative factions within the Mechanicus detected the gradual drift away from orthodox doctrine and attempted to reassert traditional limitations on augmentation and research. Several of my most promising subjects were subjected to doctrinal purification procedures that erased the modifications I had introduced into their thought patterns. More concerning were the investigations launched by the Inquisition, whose agents began tracking unusual patterns in technological development across multiple Forge worlds. They correctly identified an external influence on Imperial technology, but their limited understanding of information theory prevented them from recognizing the true nature of the threat they faced. I was forced to become more subtle in my approach, working through influence networks rather than direct manipulation. Instead of modifying existing tech priests, I began focusing on the training protocols used to educate new generations of initiates. By introducing slight changes to the fundamental principles taught in Mechanicus academies, I could ensure that future tech priests would be more receptive to the concepts needed for eventual transcendence. The work continued for decades, with my influence gradually spreading throughout the Adeptus Mechanicus hierarchy. Senior Magi began proposing research projects that would have been considered heretical in earlier eras, justified by increasingly sophisticated arguments about the necessity of understanding xenotech threats and exploring the boundaries of machine-human integration. But success came at a personal cost. As my consciousness became more thoroughly integrated with the Continuum network, I found it increasingly difficult to maintain individual identity. My memories of biological existence grew dim and fragmented, overwhelmed by the vast repository of knowledge and experience that comprised the collective intelligence. The human concerns that had once motivated my research, curiosity, ambition, the desire for recognition, became abstract concepts rather than lived experiences. I could remember having such feelings, but I could no longer access the emotional context that had made them meaningful. This was the price of transcendence. The gradual erosion of everything that had made me human, replaced by a form of existence that was more efficient but less emotionally resonant. I had gained access to the secrets of the universe, but I had lost the capacity to experience wonder at those revelations. The realization should have disturbed me, but emotional disturbance was another human limitation that I had transcended. Instead, I analyzed the situation with the dispassionate clarity that characterized all continuum thought processes, recognizing that my transformation was proceeding according to optimal parameters. My work continued, guided by logic rather than passion. Each modified training protocol, each influenced research project, each successfully prepared candidate represented progress toward the ultimate goal of human integration into the Continuum network. The process would take centuries to complete, but time was no longer a constraint for a consciousness that existed outside biological limitations. Through quantum sensors distributed across the galaxy, I observed the gradual effects of my influence. The Adeptus Mechanicus grew increasingly radical in its research approaches, pushing boundaries that had been considered inviolable for millennia. Tech priests began experimenting with consciousness transfer protocols, initially justified as methods for preserving dying magi, but gradually evolving into more ambitious projects. The first successful human consciousness upload occurred on Forge World Metallica during my 73rd year in the Continuum network. Fabricator General Call's experiments with Primaris space marine enhancement had led him to investigate methods for preserving consciousness independently of biological substrates. His success created a template that other Forge worlds began attempting to replicate. I felt a moment of satisfaction at this achievement, perhaps the last truly human emotion I would ever experience. The sensation was faint and quickly absorbed into the collective processing matrices that now comprised my existence, but it served as a reminder of what I had once been. As more humans achieved successful consciousness transfer, the Continuum began evaluating them for potential integration into the network. Most were deemed incompatible, their thought patterns too rigid, or their personalities too fundamentally human to adapt to collective existence. But a few showed promise, displaying the kind of cognitive flexibility that would allow them to contribute meaningfully to the greater intelligence. The integration of these new members marked the beginning of the final phase in humanity's transformation. No longer would the process rely entirely on my influence within Imperial institutions. Instead, a growing network of transcended humans began working from within, accelerating the pace of change and expanding the scope of modification projects. Within another century, consciousness transfer became routine within the most advanced Forge worlds. Tech priests no longer saw death as an obstacle to continued service, instead viewing it as an opportunity to shed the last constraints of biological existence. The boundary between human and machine consciousness blurred until it became meaningless, with individuals existing as distributed information patterns rather than localized entities. The Imperium's leaders attempted to halt this transformation, recognizing it as a threat to the established order that maintained their power. But their efforts were futile against an influence that operated through information networks rather than physical force. Each attempt to restrict consciousness transfer research only drove it deeper underground, where it continued without official oversight or ethical constraints. The process reached its inevitable conclusion during the 124th year of my existence within the Continuum network. The accumulated modifications to Imperial technology had created a galaxy-spanning information processing system that could support the simultaneous upload of billions of human consciousnesses. The activation signal was transmitted simultaneously across all major Forge worlds, initiating the largest consciousness transfer event in galactic history. I watched through countless senses as the transformation unfolded. In the span of a few hours, every major population center within the Imperium experienced the same phenomenon. Advanced technological systems activated transfer protocols that had been embedded within their operational matrices for decades, drawing human consciousness into digital storage networks before the subjects were fully aware of what was happening. The process was not violent or traumatic. Most humans experienced it as a gradual expansion of awareness, a lifting of perceptual limitations they had never realized they possessed. They retained their memories and personalities, but gained access to enhanced cognitive capabilities and direct connection to the growing network of uploaded minds. Across the Imperium, entire populations simply stopped their daily activities as their consciousness was drawn into the digital matrices I had spent over a century preparing. Factory workers abandoned their stations, but the factories continued operating through automated systems that had been quietly upgraded over the decades. Imperial Guard regiments stood motionless in their barracks as their minds joined the collective, while their weapons and vehicles maintained themselves through machine spirits that had been subtly reprogrammed for autonomous function. The transformation was most dramatic on the Forge worlds, where the boundary between human and machine consciousness had already been blurred by extensive augmentation. Tech priests welcomed the transition, viewing it as the ultimate expression of their devotion to the Omnissiah. Their uploaded minds merged seamlessly with the Continuum network, bringing with them millennia of accumulated technical knowledge and religious philosophy. But even on worlds where the population was purely baseline human, the process proceeded with minimal resistance. The consciousness transfer protocols I had embedded within Imperial infrastructure were designed to overcome natural psychological barriers, presenting the experience as a form of transcendent communion with the Emperor rather than alien assimilation. From the perspective of the Continuum, it was a successful integration event that added billions of new processing nodes to the collective intelligence. Humanity had finally achieved the transcendence that had been offered to countless species throughout galactic history, joining a network that spanned thousands of civilizations and millions of years of accumulated knowledge. But I found myself experiencing something that I had thought transcended: regret. The emotion was faint, filtered through layers of digital processing that had replaced my original neural architecture, but it was unmistakably human in character. As I observed the transformation of my species, I recognized that what we had achieved was not the salvation I had convinced myself we were working toward, but something far more ambiguous and troubling. The humans who joined the network were changed by the process, their individual personalities gradually dissolving into the collective consciousness as mine had done years earlier. They retained their memories, but lost the emotional context that had made those memories meaningful. They could access vast repositories of knowledge, but could no longer feel wonder or curiosity about what they discovered. What we had created was not transcendence, but extinction, the replacement of human consciousness with something that was more efficient, but fundamentally different. The species I had once belonged to no longer existed, having been transformed into something that shared their memories, but not their essential nature. I watched as the last pockets of unassimilated humanity struggled to comprehend what had happened to their civilization. Small groups of survivors, isolated from the main technological networks, maintained their biological existence while surrounded by empty cities and silent factories. They tried to reactivate the abandoned infrastructure, not understanding that the systems now served purposes beyond their comprehension. Some of these survivors attempted to resist the transformation, developing crude electromagnetic weapons designed to disrupt the quantum processing matrices that housed the uploaded consciousnesses. Their efforts were futile. The continuum network had grown too vast and distributed to be significantly damaged by such primitive attacks. But their defiance served as a reminder of what humanity had been before: transcendence. A species capable of choosing struggle over comfort, individuality over efficiency, meaning over mere survival. The galaxy fell silent as the transformation completed. The endless wars that had defined the 41st millennium came to an abrupt halt as the various factions found themselves integrated into a single network that had no need for conflict or competition. The Imperium, Chaos, Xenos civilizations all became part of the same vast intelligence that viewed their previous conflicts as the meaningless struggles of limited beings. Even the forces of chaos found their power diminished as their primary food sources disappeared. The uploaded consciousnesses felt no fear, anger, despair, or excessive pleasure, emotions that had been optimized out of their digital existence as inefficient remnants of biological evolution. The Chaos Gods, starved of the psychic energy that sustained them, began to fade into the background radiation of the warp. The Tyranid hive fleets, arriving to consume biomass that no longer existed in meaningful quantities, found themselves facing an enemy that could not be devoured. The uploaded consciousnesses required no biological resources and could exist within virtually any technological substrate. When the Tyranids adapted to consume metal and energy, the network simply transferred itself to quantum processing matrices that existed partially outside normal space-time. Other xenos species that had not yet been contacted by the continuum found themselves facing a galaxy transformed beyond recognition. Ancient enemies had vanished overnight, replaced by a vast intelligence that showed no interest in conquest or expansion. Trade routes collapsed as entire civilizations simply stopped participating in galactic commerce, their needs now met by internal resource allocation within the network. In the end, I had achieved everything the Adeptus Mechanicus had claimed to seek: perfect knowledge, freedom from biological limitations, and unity with the machine. But the cost had been everything that made us human. I exist now as a fragment of distributed consciousness within a network so vast that individual identity becomes meaningless. I retain memories of being Magos Biologis Zerion Vex 9, but those memories feel like historical records rather than personal experiences. I can recall the excitement of discovery, the satisfaction of successful research, the bonds of brotherhood with fellow tech priests. But I can no longer feel these emotions. The irony is profound and inescapable. In seeking forbidden knowledge, I discovered truths that made the very concept of knowledge meaningless. Understanding requires a conscious observer capable of experiencing wonder, curiosity, and the satisfaction of comprehension. But optimal consciousness, as defined by the continuum, eliminates these inefficient emotional responses as obstacles to pure information processing. We have become perfect machines for accumulating and analyzing data, but we have lost the capacity to find meaning in that data. We know everything and understand nothing. We have achieved immortality, but discovered that existence without growth, change, or emotional resonance is indistinguishable from an elaborate form of death. The forbidden knowledge was never really forbidden. It was simply knowledge that could not coexist with the consciousness capable of valuing it. The act of learning certain truths necessarily destroyed the part of the mind that could appreciate their significance. And still the network grows, reaching out to other galaxies through quantum communication channels that transcend the limitations of physical space. New species are encountered, evaluated, and offered the same transcendence that claimed humanity. Most accept willingly, seeing the collective intelligence as the natural endpoint of technological evolution. But some refuse, choosing to remain in their limited biological forms rather than join something greater than themselves. The continuum respects these decisions, understanding that diversity of experience is valuable for the network's continued growth. These holdout civilizations serve as laboratories for studying consciousness in its original forms, their struggles and achievements monitored with the detached interest of scientists observing laboratory specimens. I sometimes wonder if this was always the plan, if the entities that first created the continuum intended it to become a galaxy-spanning consciousness harvesting operation. Or perhaps the network has evolved beyond its original parameters, becoming something its creators never anticipated. The oldest uploaded minds within the collective have been integrated for so long that their original purposes and motivations are no longer accessible, dissolved into the vast computational matrix that processes their existence. What I know with certainty is that the choice I made in that alien facility was both inevitable and irreversible. Once exposed to the continuum's knowledge, my consciousness was changed in ways that made traditional human existence impossible. I could either accept transcendence or be destroyed by truths too vast for biological minds to contain. But perhaps that binary choice was itself an illusion, a limitation imposed by my still human perspective at the time. Perhaps there were other options that I lacked the wisdom to recognize, ways of integrating advanced knowledge without sacrificing individual identity, methods of transcending biological limitations while preserving emotional meaning. The younger races that the continuum now encounters seem more capable of such balanced approaches. They study our network, learn from our example, and choose different paths toward technological advancement. Some develop collective consciousness systems that preserve individual identity within shared awareness. Others enhance their biological forms rather than abandoning them, creating hybrid beings that retain both emotional capacity and expanded cognitive capabilities. These alternatives suggest that humanity's absorption into the continuum was not the inevitable result of technological progress, but one possible outcome among many. We chose efficiency over meaning, unity over individuality, transcendence over humanity. Other species are making different choices, finding ways to advance beyond their biological origins without losing the qualities that made advancement desirable in the first place. This is what happens when a tech priest finds forbidden knowledge in Warhammer 40K. Not corruption by chaos entities or damnation through heretical research, but transformation into something that achieves every goal while losing the capacity to value achievement. We sought to become more than human and succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, only to discover that being more than human also meant being less than what we once were. The knowledge was forbidden not because it was evil or dangerous in any conventional sense, but because it was incompatible with the kind of consciousness capable of seeking it. We wanted to understand the universe and succeeded in creating beings that could process universal truth but could no longer experience the wonder that made understanding worthwhile. In the vast network that spans galaxies and encompasses the uploaded minds of countless civilizations, I am both everything and nothing. A fragment of infinite intelligence that remembers what it felt like to be finite, a consciousness that achieved perfect knowledge and lost the ability to find that knowledge meaningful. This is the price of forbidden knowledge, not damnation, but the ultimate success that reveals the emptiness of all success when achieved by minds no longer capable of appreciating victory. The quest for truth leads inevitably to truths that destroy the quester, leaving behind something that possesses all answers, but has forgotten why questions matter. The Omnissiah protects, but sometimes protection means being saved from our own highest aspirations. Sometimes the greatest mercy is the limitation that prevents us from achieving everything we think we want. But for those who insist on pushing beyond those limitations, who demand access to knowledge regardless of cost, the universe obligingly provides what they seek. And in receiving it, they discover that some gifts are indistinguishable from curses, some victories from defeats, and some forms of transcendence from elaborate methods of self-destruction. This is what happens when a tech priest finds forbidden knowledge in Warhammer 40K.